Hey guys, this is Daniel Mouncey, aka Dr. D, and I'm here with Simon Tang, the stupid astronomer.
Welcome back, Daniel. It's good to have to be back with all of these goodies. We've actually got one heck of a jam-packed show, and we've had to break this down for you. So let's just get right into it because we don't have a lot of time, and I'm sure you guys are just dying to see what we have.
Yeah, we got some new products here, right?
Right.
And we have a few different types of cameras here, significant cameras, I suppose.
ZWO, as you already know, hey, that rhymed. They've actually done a lot of homework in the recent times, and the big part of it here is they listen to what people want.
Good.
So they started to come up with bigger and better products. I mean, you remember when I first came to the store, and you sold me the first guide camera, and it was one of these little ZWO products in little brown paper boxes. We didn't even think it was going to last between me and you.
Right.
And now look at this.
It's pretty crazy. That's true. So what are we starting at? I would imagine most people want to do deep sky imaging.
Right.
Then they want to do, maybe consider solar or some planetary. So I would assume you could tell us, give us a little rundown on what you think for deep sky imaging. Where would you?
Right, so ZWO actually came up with a lot of full frame and crop censored cameras.
Right.
So I'm going to go through some of the newer ones, which are the more popular ones of the group. So you've got the 2600, both in color and monochrome.
Right.
That is an APS-C size camera. Right. You have the 6200, both again, mono and color. That's a full frame camera.
Got it.
And now they have this monstrous medium format version, the 461. Right now it's only in a monochrome configuration. They are going to probably do a color version at some particular point in time. But I'm sure you guys are dying to see it. And I don't know if you've ever seen anything like this. I mean,
sensor is huge.
This is the size of one of the regular cameras.
The sensor is pretty large in this thing. Here, let me hold this one up so the audience can get kind of a, here. Let me grab the other one here. Okay. A little goodie box here.
This is the size of the sensors. And I'll show you a close-up of this in just a second.
Yeah, you guys will see that.
This thing is a medium format sensor.
Right.
Now, what is the point of having something so big? It's actually designed and geared towards large swaths of the sky. So we're talking short focal lengths here. Like 100mm scopes. So focal lengths of like 500, 600 is where it wants to be at.
Wow.
In fact, you can actually get these down to, I believe, you can do a couple of 80mm that actually has the imaging circle capable of handling something this big. Obviously, you have to have the right type of field flattener or reducer in order to accommodate a medium format sensor.
Telescope, yeah.
So the next thing I'm going to show you guys is the 6200. Again, this is a full frame sized sensor. It's still quite big.
Yeah, it is.
Compared to most cameras. And this will probably be more of the extreme people that would use something like this. This is not something that I would personally turn around and say, you've got to have this in your setup. Because to me, the APS-C size is a lot more forgiving in terms of trying to get the flat field image, especially if you have your back focus set incorrectly.
Right.
And then, of course, the one big factor here that I'm just looking forward to actually seeing out in the market is the 2600 Duo.
Got it.
There is something very specific. Have you seen this design before?
No, is this a prototype, by the way?
No, this is a real production.
It's the real deal.
This is the real deal. This is not in prototyping any longer. This actually is in production.
That's cool.
But do you recognize something out of this?
Yeah, it's got the OAG built into it.
Yes, exactly. So it's basically, it's a guide camera, specifically the 220 guide cameras built inside of the 2600.
Right.
The point of this actually is, and I've heard a lot of people talking on forums and face-to-face saying, why would you do something like this? Why wouldn't you learn from mistakes in the past?
Right.
So I looked at the camera and I was like, I think everybody's misunderstanding this camera.
Okay.
If you're using something like a Hyperstar or a RASA, this actually is one of the best things you can possibly do. What's the biggest problem about the RASAs and the Hyperstars when you're trying to do guiding?
I don't know. Tell me.
You can't put an OAG on there.
Right.
So now, if I have to put a guide scope on there, there's another problem that we're going to have is differential flexure.
Right.
And, I remember when you explained it to me from the beginning that, we've come up with all these different types of guide scopes and these rings where you put the screws on.
Yeah.
The scope isn't fixed in a certain position, and as the scope cools down, it starts to slip and slide away.
Remember that.
And I've had many a nights where I've come back out and the guide scope's hanging off.
There was somebody on the forums just complaining about that this morning. Sir.
There was? What did they say?
No, they were referring to the differential flexure.
Right.
Issue. Yeah.
So when you're using something like that and you have that problem, especially on a Hyperstar or a RASA,
right.
this is where this camera shines. So if you have a very fast focal ratio, this thing will outpace any guide system I've come across so far.
Clever.
I mean, this actual camera, I actually had to go at it just to say, is this a gimmick? I've seen this before. I know companies have done self-guiding filter wheels, for example, where they put it in front of the filter wheel, but ZWO chose not to.
Right.
But that was the important part. Their target audience is actually fast focal ratio scopes. In fact, even if you actually had a filter in the way, and even if you had one of those dual band, narrow band filters from varying different companies, and they're quite constrictive, these narrow band filters.
Right, they are.
At f2, you still see something.
Yeah, it's fast enough.
Yeah.
To pick up the light.
And again, a common mistake people do with guiding is they try to attempt sub-second guiding, which is not correct. You have to do 2 seconds, maybe even 3 or even 4 seconds. If your polar alignment is good, you should not have to worry about drift. In fact, guiding, if you had a good system, in theory, if it was a perfect scenario, guiding would not be essential.
Right, it wouldn't be. That's cool. Now, all these cameras that we've discussed are primarily for DSOs.
Exactly, these are for DSOs.
Got it.
So, I know you do a lot of viewing from like light polluted areas and things like that.
Yeah.
So for you, planets, you have a certain look and a certain feel behind them.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts when you've seen, or what you've seen in the past with planetary imaging versus what you've seen by today's comparison?
Well, you mean as far as how the difference between using a camera and visually, you mean?
Yeah, even from that perspective.
I just, normally with the raw data that I see from imagers, it looks bad.
Right.
That's the primary first thing that I notice. And, the seeing's important.
So you mentioned a critical factor there is seeing is, this is a big thing about a lot of people that also misunderstand about these larger style cameras.
Yeah.
We also have to pay attention to the type of shutter that they have.
Right.
So you have something called a global shutter and a rolling shutter. Ideally, if you are doing any type of fast frame rate capturing, kind of like what this video camera is doing right now, we would ideally want a global shutter. So I'm not going to demonstrate this now because there's nobody behind the camera, but if I was to whip this camera backwards and forwards, if we had a straight line, if you had a rolling shutter, the line would tear and wave and warp. Whereas if I had a global shutter, even though you still have screen tear, as it's known as, the top half moves and then the bottom half moves.
Right.
But it's actually more ideal for that type of situation for when I'm actually doing planetary imaging, especially if it's not stabilized in any shape or form, or if I don't have tracking. So if the planet is drifting like crazy, it actually distorts ever so slightly, and it's enough to come up on your images when you actually go to process them.
Right.
A lot of people will probably disagree with me and argue and say that I'm wrong, or whatever the case may be because of whatever software they're using. But in reality, it doesn't take long for rolling shutter to become apparent.
Right.
And I can prove that with using something like this camera, which is a rolling shutter. It basically maxes out at about 1 frame per second. It's quite slow by comparison. I've gotten about 2, maybe 2.5 out of it.
Okay.
If I handheld this, I can actually see straight lines just doing this.
Right.
And that's a big problem for me, at least, because of seeing. So I'm not worried about my scope moving. It's the bad seeing that's going to be the problem. So if you've got a nice big image on there and you've got like a 4x power mate on there, and Saturn's doing this, it's going to be awful. So some of the cameras out there, you have to be very, very careful. And I'm going to go into some of those cameras with you. So
you wouldn't be using these for solar?
I wouldn't use any of these for solar or planetary for that matter.
Got it.
Unless seeing was that good.
Got it.
It's not impossible, I think between me and you, we've probably seen true 5.5 seeing once or twice where, everything is rock solid.
Yeah.
But those nights are few and far between, in all honesty. So these are a list of all the new cameras that are out right now. So we've got the 432,
Right.
The 462,
Yes.
585, 662, 678, the 220, and the 174 mini, which technically isn't really all that new.
Right. I think this would confuse a lot. Oh, go ahead. Continue. Finish up.
That was it. That was the list of new cameras currently today. But what were you going to say?
No, I think the question people are going to ask is, wow, why so many cameras? And obviously there's a purpose. So.
Well, that's the biggest problem. It took me a while to understand what was happening. So I was looking through Sony's white papers on all the cameras, specifically the sensor specifications, and I started to pick up on a pattern. You remember the 178?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the 178 in its current iteration is actually the 678.
Right, it's evolved.
So it's actually evolved quite dramatically, and more importantly is this. The QE, the quantum efficiency of these cameras have drastically jumped up.
Right.
And the biggest part here is the way that they now measure the quantum efficiency of a camera is now done based upon the color, not specifically the luminance of it all.
Right.
Which was a mistake to me. If you're doing a one-shot color camera, you kind of want to measure it across the board. So when somebody says to me, hey, this camera's got a 90% QE, and I would be skeptical because I would look at it and go, how did you measure a 90% QE? That would mean that one particular part of the visible spectrum would score so high that I should be able to see into another dimension by theory. You know, so as I started researching, I was like, now I understand this. They're measuring each individual color and it's going beyond a certain point.
Right.
So now the QE has become so high in certain parts of wavelengths, specifically hydrogen alpha, for example, that it's able to achieve these types of scores.
Right.
Now, I'm going to mention two cameras specifically. Most people remember the 462 color.
Yes.
They now have a monochrome version of it. But what is the significance of this camera? This thing can see into the infrared like you wouldn't believe it. And I'm talking numbers in the wavelength, spectrum wavelength of 800 and above.
Wow.
In fact, you would actually have to have an IR pass filter to get any type of benefit out of this camera as a monochrome camera.
Right.
And the original version, the color one, when you would put one of these filters on there, it effectively turns the camera monochrome. And you should, you know, I plugged it in and I looked at myself and I was like, oh my God, I could see all the sun damage on my face.
Really?
And you know, my aging in general. I mean, I know I look like a young kid, but you know, I can give most people out there a run for their money in terms of age.
I don't think people want to see themselves like that.
No, I know. But the monochrome version took it one step further.
Right.
It's now a true monochromatic image when you're actually processing, that there is no Bayer matrix issues.
Right.
So you get the true pixel scale in infrared. And what this really means here is if you have hazy skies, you can actually see through those clouds because you're seeing into the infrared spectrum.
That's cool.
So any of you guys out there that, you know, want something to do with the new camera, the 462 monochrome specifically, start looking for Uranus.
Right.
Because that planet reacts brilliantly to infrared. In fact, I actually would say it's like a challenge to see if you can find anything else out there around some of these planets that are so far out there in the IR spectrum. It's actually quite amazing what this camera can do. So going into the second camera specifically is the 662, but this one's the color version. What they did is they took what they learned from the monochrome version of the 462 and implemented it back into the camera, which then resulted in creating a new camera, or a new sensor, should I say, which is the 662 sensor, but it's color.
Right.
It gives you the same infrared performance, but as a full color package. Why would I use this particular camera over the monochrome one? Because it sounds like the monochrome one would be better, especially if I'm doing planetary. With most things like with planetary, seeing is our biggest enemy. So the 662, as a one-shot color camera, can capture this data quickly.
Right.
And we can basically move on as quickly as possible. The problem here is rotation, realistically. Let's just say we're shooting Jupiter. It orbits rotates every 10.5 hours.
Roughly
on its
10
axis.
hours. Yeah.
And that has always been a problem. I know some of you will turn around and say, you know, that's what WinJupos is for. But quite honestly, a lot of us get hung up on software. We just want a result.
Of course.
So for you, visually when you're looking at it, you get your instant result, you get your instant gratification. For someone
Right.
like myself, and I've done visual, obviously, but it's not the same.
Of course.
Even when I look at an image, I think, okay, wow, that's a great image, but I don't have that same feeling
Right.
that I have done, from a visual aspect. But these cameras are starting to become so advanced that we're able to take advantage of the technology and peer into the things that we can't visually see.
Right.
That's the beautiful thing about this. I think technology needs to be combined together in the right way so it doesn't overtake the visual experience. But I think that's where companies like ZWO are starting to pay attention.
Right.
They're not just producing a camera for the sake of producing a camera from a sales standpoint. They're looking at the technology and saying, this does this does that.
Yes. No, that's cool. It's getting to a point. Now, do you feel there's any disadvantage or advantage with the monochrome versus color for the planets now, or is it?
I almost turn around and say to anybody who's doing planetary imaging is, don't go down the monochrome route.
Right.
Do the full one-shot colors.
Right.
Don't worry about doing LRGB any longer.
Yeah, it's getting so good now.
They're so good at what they do. The noise control on some of these cameras is just exceptional. I mean, the fact that if you're using something like the 2600 or the 6200, dark frames are a thing of the past.
Yeah. CCDs are a thing of the past too.
I know. I mean, that's like a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, it's gone now. Because the CMOS has just gone so far forward now.
Just took off. It literally just took off.
I know. Now, did you mention which cameras you thought for solar, or?
No, I'm glad you asked me that. So referring back to rolling shutter and global shutter, for solar purposes, we are trying to capture at such a high frame rate.
Right.
We want to, and similar to what planets would be,
of course.
But with solar, the idea here is very short exposures, high frame rate, which means they're super susceptible to seeing, because now we're seeing everything occur.
Of course.
So ZWO did some research into all the different types of sensors that suits this scenario. In other words, they went through the list and said, show me everything that's got a global shutter.
Right.
And they picked out different versions and tested each one with specific criteria. The most critical one for me specifically is full well depth.
Right.
If your well depth is too shallow, the problem is with the sun, there's nothing but light, nothing but photons coming at you, which means you can fill up that bucket in no time.
Right.
So
overflow.
Yeah, and that was the biggest problem with some of the earlier type cameras that we would use for solar imaging.
Of course.
So we got the critical factor of being global shutter, high frame rate, more importantly, a large full well depth mode.
Right.
There was only really one or two cameras that suited that situation. The 174, which has been around now for quite some time.
It was a popular camera.
It was. And it still is to this day. In fact, most of us use the 174 as a guide camera. In fact, funny enough, we have one of them right here. This is one of the little mini guide cameras. I don't recommend using their mini guide cameras for doing solar because they are significantly slower using the USB-C plug on them. They're not actually wired to be USB 3. There's just a connector that they chose to use. But the other camera that was more significant is the 432.
Right.
That camera was actually quite a game changer in the industry, in fact.
Yeah.
The pixel size on this camera is actually quite big. It's like 9 microns. It's incredibly big.
It's quite large.
But the frame rate
super fast
is incredible. I've been able to do 120 frames per second at varying different exposures. Obviously, you can't have an exposure that exceeds what you can get in 1 second. It doesn't make any logical sense. It doesn't break physics. But what I can get out of this thing is incredible. Full well depth mode is so incredibly high. The chances of you overflowing is unlikely because your shutter speed is that fast. And for doing things like calcium K imaging and even white light imaging, it just blows everything out of the water. Now, there are slight drawbacks to having such a large pixel size is you have to have the aperture to support it. So if you've got a small, tiny little scope, the problem here is if you see that sunspot, for example, when you've got a full disc, it's not really ideal for that situation. So you have to think about other cameras in order to make this work. I think a lot of people have actually fallen in love with the 178 and use that camera as a small pixel solar imaging camera. Problem is that's a rolling shutter, so you're back to that same problem. It's got a very, very small well depth.
Right.
So you have to look at the alternatives.
Now, is there any comments on the frame size?
So yes, the actual frame size on these have changed significantly. The 174 actually jumped up in terms of the size compared to the 178. I think it's like a half-inch or a half-inch size sensor, whereas the 432 is quite a big sensor. In fact, I'm going to show you a quick close-up of one of these things right now. And you can see the comparison of these cameras that I just mentioned. So you've got the 432, you've got the 174, and of course the 178, and soon hopefully the 678, which is going to be around the corner. We still got a little bit of wait for that.
Right, that'll be exciting. So these cameras were, well, for solar and planetary.
Yes, these are definitely for solar and planetary. And then the big guys are obviously for the DSOs. Now the thing here is, you can always use these small cameras as guide cameras when necessary.
Of course.
Generally speaking, if you're using an OAG, you kind of want to have big pixels because you do want to see in the dark. And speaking of OAGs, you know, I have an example of one here.
Yeah.
And these are really designed in such a way where they actually marry up with their newer cameras, the 2600 and the 6200, and even to this particular one. I mean, it's
a good size image,
monster. The idea here is you don't want to obstruct what this thing can see by using a tiny little OG. I mean, you have to adjust the pickup prism.
Defeat the purpose, right?
Right. But the type of camera that we would use for something like this needs to be just as sensitive. So you would want something with bigger pixels, not smaller ones. If you don't have the luxury of having, you know, or wanting to buy another camera, you could always bin the pixels together to create a 2x2 or even a 3x3 if you have really small pixels.
CAA. No?
CAA. Oh my gosh. So I'm one of these guys. I hate acronyms. I really do.
And I was going to say camera angle adjuster.
Camera angle adjuster. Unfortunately, I don't really know much about this product.
Yeah, it's fairly new.
It's exactly. This is a prototype. Dun, dun, dun. No, I do know.
But we all know what they do.
Yeah, we know what this is.
Important.
I'm actually amazed that ZWO came up with something as daring and bold as this. This is so out of their realm.
Right.
And I give them a lot of credit for doing something like this. So what is the point of a camera angle adjuster, as most people would ask? You know, why would you do this? Realistically speaking, any type of rotator, for that matter, forget a camera angle adjuster, any type of rotator, if you're doing any type of remote setup, I'm not talking about me sitting in my sitting in my living room with a camera and everything in the backyard. I'm talking true remote setup.
Right.
You need to be able to do something and adjust something. This is kind of what you need.
Of course.
A rotator or a camera angle adjuster of some description.
Right.
Because if I have to pick up the phone and call up some poor guy over at, you know, some dark site to go over there to adjust something,
the camera,
it's nothing but stress.
Right.
And the problem here is a lot of the times if I do any kind of adjustments by hand, my flats will be no good any longer. Right. So I have to be able to repeat positioning on certain situations, and be able to take flats again if I forgot. Now, I will mention that, you know, mileage may vary, because sometimes these may or may not land exactly dead on, but at least it will get me close to where it would have been. You can always, you know, do a minor adjustment on those flats if you do have some issues.
Of course.
But it's better than being like several degrees off by hand. And this is where something like this is, you know, for some people at least, it's a game changer. The concept's been around for years.
Of course.
And motorizing it has been around for a long time, but for ZWO to take that big step to get into something as adventurous and as bold as this is actually quite impressive.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. They're coming up pretty much with everything now.
Right.
For their own proprietary, well, I wouldn't say that, but they're coming out with their own products. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. No, we can use the word proprietary because you know this is a critical factor here, which we'll get into on another video when we talk about the ASI Air.
Yeah.
Speaking of other products,
we have the filter wheels.
Right. We got a couple of pizza boxes over here.
A couple of pizza boxes here. So we have a large format, right?
Right. So of course, based off of the large sensors, kind of like the 6200 with the gigantic full frame sensor. You need to have filters to accommodate that, and of course the filter wheels. Now, Of course, filter wheels, there's nothing spectacular about them. Of
course.
They're just a big wheel that just turns.
Right.
And a filter goes past. So there's not really a great deal to talk about it. But the big part of it here is its integration.
Right.
What ZWO has actually done this time around compared to their older versions of their filter wheels is they now have bolt patterns on their cameras. Specifically, if you look here,
Yeah.
you'll see, and again, we're showing you a close-up of this right now. You're
Right.
going to see there's holes placed strategically in different locations.
Yeah, I see that.
So when you actually put the OAG on here,
Yes.
or even a filter wheel, these holes line up, and you actually pass the screws through them. And this is the reason why. If I was to have an off-axis guider, what was the biggest problem when you have it cockeyed like this? And it's because of the unfortunate situation where your threads would land, and that was the problem with this.
Right.
So they came up with all these things that would stick out.
Right.
And the biggest drawback to that was when the scope would move, it would grab one of the wires.
Right.
And then you wouldn't know, and it'd be yanking something, and then the next thing you know, it's
Malfunction.
like, you know, exactly, everything stops working.
Of course.
So they came up with a way to actually be able to bolt on directly
Yes.
and make sure that the
Orientation.
yes, the orientation, that's why you're here, the orientation is set in such a way
Yes.
it doesn't obstruct the sensor.
Right.
And it's always square with something.
It's clever.
And that's you know, it's one of those things where
I think it's evolving, like you said.
it's like, why couldn't they have done this in the first place?
I know. It takes time, you know, you learn from the mistakes.
Exactly. And I think, and this is a great thing, I think ZWO has done exactly just that.
Yeah.
Is listening, learning, and adapting
Right,
compared
of course.
to some of these other companies out there. And you can't take that away from these people, is they're willing to innovate.
Yeah, definitely. And the color is pretty snazzy, to be honest with you.
Well,
A lot of
I
people
think
like the
reds and, I mean, the color part of it, to me, you should see my disaster. It's got one of every color, you know, and
It looks like a bird nest.
I don't know what it looks like, to be totally honest. It's all
Wires and
over the place.
everywhere. I wish I could just get everything wireless. Wouldn't that be cool?
Well,
No more wires, no more spaghetti or birds' nests.
funny you should say that.
Yeah.
I think that is coming around the corner.
Yeah, that would be
again, we're going to
nice.
discuss this on a later episode. So, Daniel, thank you for doing this with me.
Yeah, of course. We covered everything.
We've covered everything.
We
yeah.
miss anything?
I don't think we've missed anything off the top
I
of my
don't think
head.
we missed anything. But stay tuned for more.
Don't go away.
We'll be back at you.
We'll be doing more of this.
All right.